it is the best electoral results for the far right since the time of Hitler. I mean, that in any sort of normal democratic country would be reason to sort of pause for thought and a reason for concern. But for it to happen in Germany, where the taboo over Nazism is understandably so strong, is, I'd say, a real moment.
I'm David Knowles, and this is Battle Lines.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark.
This week, I speak to Middle East correspondent Jotam Confino on the latest updates from Israel, where Israelis took to the streets as Hamas executed more hostages. Then we speak to our Europe editor James Crisp on the implications and explanations of the rise of the far right in Germany. It's Friday, the 6th of September. First, let's go to Israel, to our Middle East correspondent, Jotam Confino. Thank you so much for your time. Firstly, could you just talk us through some of the major updates from Israel as you see them?
Yes, I think the biggest story right now is the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu is insisting on a key demand in the ceasefire negotiations with Hamas. He's refusing to give up control of a buffer zone separating Egypt from Gaza. It might sound a bit technical, but this is the main story and has been for a while now. And Netanyahu is insisting that in order for Israel to defeat Hamas fully, they must cut off the oxygen line, which is the buffer zone separating Gaza from Egypt. And the reason why he's saying that is because Hamas has smuggled weapons from Egypt into Gaza for years. And this is causing huge drama inside Israel because Hamas is refusing to give in to this demand. Hamas is saying, in order for there to be a ceasefire, Israel has to remove all of its forces completely from Gaza, including from this corridor, which is known as the Philadelphia corridor. Now, this is causing huge anger inside Israel because this weekend, Hamas executed 6 hostages. They were found inside a tunnel in Gaza by Israeli special forces. And when Israel announced that they had been killed, that they had been executed, mass demonstrations erupted the same evening. And the following day, more than 500,000 Israelis went to the streets, both in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, all over the country, really. And their anger was aimed at Netanyahu, because they say that he's deliberately torpedoing the ceasefire negotiations by sticking to this key demand of keeping control of the Philadelphia corridor.
Why would he do that? What's in it for him? Could you spell out the logic?
Yeah, so Netanyahu now has a decision to make. Either he listens to his ministers in the government, specifically those who come from the far-right parties, who have told him over and over they will not accept a ceasefire with Hamas. If Netanyahu strikes a deal with Hamas, they will leave the government, and that means that there will be held new elections. In other words, Netanyahu will be toppled. So he has to make a decision. Either he'll listen to them, which he's doing now, continuing to fight Hamas, damage them as much as possible, but risk hostages getting killed, which they are being, or strike a deal with Hamas, get out the hostages, but fall politically. And that's a decision he has made over and over. He keeps sticking with his ministers. He keeps sticking to his demand with the ceasefire. And this is why people accuse him of deliberately leaving the hostages to die.
We've heard talk of the ceasefire negotiations for months and months. Does it feel to you on the ground in Israel like it could be any closer? Could this be it?
We're hearing so many different reports, and honestly, it's almost impossible to know what to believe here. The sources that I speak to, they say that this Philadelphia corridor is important, but it's not that important as Mr. Netanyahu is making it out to be. Even the defense minister is also saying that Israel could always go back and take control of this corridor down the line. The most important thing right now is to get the hostages out. I don't see that there's any compromise on the horizon. We're hearing reports about maybe Israel would be willing to leave control of this corridor in the first phase of a ceasefire. But I don't think Hamas is willing to accept this. Hamas has been very, very clear, and I spoke to a Hamas official the other day, said without Israel withdrawing fully from the Philadelphia corridor, there's nothing to talk about. So the Americans seem to be relatively optimistic, at least officially. But I think when you ask Israelis and Palestinians, for that matter, they're not that optimistic.
It's it's approaching a year's anniversary of October the 7th. What's your sense of how Israeli society has changed during that time? I mean, as you said, there's been demonstrations, people are out on the streets again. That's been a feature over the past few months. How has Israeli society, have people changed in that time?
It's interesting that you keep hearing the same thing mentioned over and over by people sitting in TV studios, writing in Israeli newspapers. They all say the same thing. If the hostages don't get out alive, if they're all left to die inside Gaza, Israel will never be the same country again. This is too big of a trauma to just forget about and to continue as if nothing happened. It has already changed Israel significantly, in the sense that, first of all, Israel's, I would say, intelligence agencies have failed miserably in a way that has never happened in Israel's history before. Even the Yom Kippur War in 1973 caused less damage to Israel than October the 7th. So in that sense, Israel has been through shock, trauma. It's still undergoing trauma. And many people have really lost faith in not only politicians, but also the decision makers in Israel's defense brass. And that is very serious because IDF, the Israeli military, is quite a respected institution. It's something that all Israelis look up to. But this miserable failure on October the 7th has really shaken them. And I believe that the society is only beginning not to heal, actually, but just picking up the pieces and trying to just get through this hell that it is for the whole nation.
What's your experience, Jotam, of Israeli media? How is the ongoing war talked about in the papers and in the TV studios?
It's interesting to see how Israeli media go into the same kind of emergency mode as the military and as the rest of the country, really. Because at the end of the day, they're also Israelis, and they are also part of this war, whether they want it or not. And that means that, unfortunately, I would say the media fails to represent the facts in the most accurate way possible, because many of them are affected by this. Many of them know people who were killed, and they're all trying to make the country survive this in the best possible way. It doesn't mean that they don't criticize the IDF. They criticize Netanyahu tremendously. They criticize the IDF. But I think they fail to show what's happening inside Gaza. And that, I think, is something that's really lacking here. And the same, if you look at the Palestinian media, it's even worse, I would say. There's absolutely no empathy or sympathy or showing of the Israeli side. So in that sense, they're both failing in showing the misery going on the other side.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Gaza. I know there were a couple of points you wanted to pick up. What are you hearing out of Gaza?
So I think the most interesting and the most positive coming out of Gaza right now is the fact that more than 150,000 children have been vaccinated against polio just this week. This is a major undertaking for any organization inside a war zone like Gaza. Gaza is not a normal war zone. It is an urban warfare war zone with 2 million people, and now they're trying to vaccinate 600,000 children in the span of a couple of days. They've succeeded in vaccinating 150,000, which is astonishing, really. Israel brought in more than 1 million vaccines last week to prepare for this. So Israel is coordinating this with the WHO and with UNICEF. And so far, it's been going well. But again, this isn't really a relief of the humanitarian situation inside Gaza. More aid is still needed, although it has stabilized. The amount of trucks coming into Gaza every day is much better now than it has been previously in the war. So food is still getting in. There's still an issue with Hamas stealing aid. We know this not just from Gazan civilians saying this, but also for media reports and from video documentation. So overall, the situation has stabilized somewhat when it comes to aid. But as long as Israel keeps dropping bombs in these areas where Hamas are hiding in civilian areas, the misery will continue.
Could we talk a little bit more about this polio vaccination efforts? Could you tell us what exactly had to go into this to make it a success? Presumably, people have to talk to Hamas, people have to talk to the IDF to make sure that there are safe areas where they can operate. What do we know about what went into it?
It's a good question. First of all, there had to be a humanitarian ceasefire in the areas where they vaccinate. You cannot vaccinate people if bombs are dropping around you or on you, for that matter. So that was the first thing that had to go into place. And that was quite a big deal in Israel, to allow a humanitarian ceasefire in certain areas of Gaza, something that a lot of Israelis were not happy with, because they say that as long as our hostages don't receive any food, any medical attention, no vaccinations, nothing, then we shouldn't give Palestinians a free pass to vaccinate. That's the opinion of some Israelis. But nevertheless, this is what Israel agreed to. So what happened was that on Sunday, a humanitarian ceasefire began at 6 in the morning and it lasted 9 hours until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And in specific areas in Gaza, 3 specific zones, Israel and the organizations taking care of this had simply prepared to do this mass vaccine rollout. The WHO trained more than 2,000 people in Gaza to help vaccinate, of course, along with other doctors and nurses. So it's a huge deal. It's supposed to last a couple of days, but it's continuing. As of now, it's continuing. And when they reach those 600,000 children, we will see this humanitarian ceasefire end.
Final question from me, Jotam. One of the stories that we've heard pop up a lot when we've come back to the war between Hamas and Israel is Israel's northern border and this threat potentially of a new front opening with Hezbollah launching rockets at Israeli towns and civilians and the IDF. Is there anything more on this that you can tell us? It seems to me like the northern border has been relatively quiet for the last few weeks. Is that right?
Yes, relative compared to, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks ago. We don't have 200-300 rockets a day now. No, it's like 30, 40, 50, depending on the day. So it's relatively calmed down. But again, it's still extremely aggressive what's happening on both sides of the border. Israel is still carrying out every single day airstrikes in Lebanon, somewhere in Lebanon, attacking Hezbollah positions. But we're back to this tit-for-tat thing. And it's quite interesting to see how we went from a couple of weeks talking about a full-on regional war to now all eyes are again on Gaza. We keep shifting our focus back and forth. Hezbollah has said that their punishment of Israel's assassination of one of their top commanders in Beirut, that was successfully done. In other words, they don't need to retaliate in a more aggressive way than they are doing now. They're back to normal, so to say. Then you have Iran, which is still waiting to launch its major retaliation against Israel for the alleged assassination of a Hamas leader in Tehran. Now, we're still waiting for that. So it's not as if we're back to a normal situation. Everything could escalate within minutes here. But currently, all eyes are on Gaza and these ceasefire talks, which aren't really going anywhere.
So just to finish then, Jotam, what should our listeners be paying attention to in terms of the news in Israel over the next week?
I would pay attention to the amount of people going on the streets in Israel, because this is the Israeli public's way of pressuring Netanyahu and trying to topple him. I don't think it will happen the next week or 2 or 3 weeks for that matter, but it's something you should look out for. And you should also look out for what's happening inside Gaza, because if we see more hostages being executed, this could potentially ignite everything, because Israel will respond harshly. So those 2 things are what I would be watching out for in the coming week or 2.
Jotam, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention?
There's always they always have things to talk about here, but I would say that those issues are the most important. Now, we can also mention, of course, the UK arms embargo or restrictions of arms.
Yeah. What's your thinking there?
So it's interesting that it comes now. We knew that it was coming, but it came the same day as Israel were burying hostages who were executed by Hamas. This, for Israel, was a slap in the face, and I spoke to several officials the same day who called it a miserable decision. they were immensely angry with what the UK signaled to the rest of the world. It might not have a huge practical implication or effect on Israel's army, but it does have an effect. Some of those spare parts, components that go into fighter jets, drones, helicopters, those are components that Israel cannot just go out and buy in a store. It's something that you have to look for. It takes time. So it does damage Israel's defense capabilities. And more importantly, it's a signal to Israel's enemies that the UK is now taking a step back. And that's something that really angered Israel.
Jotam, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, David.
Now let's go north, back into Europe, and speak to our Europe editor James Crisp, who's been following the turbulent German local elections. Nazi stormtroopers once engraved the motto "Everything for Germany" on their service daggers, but Björn Höcke, the victor in Thuringia's historic state elections, claims it is nothing more than a campaign slogan. The Alternative for Germany politician led the far right to the largest electoral success in the country since the Third Reich on Sunday. Europe editor James Crisp, can you bring us up to speed? What is happening in Germany?
Yeah, so we've had these state elections, which, as you said, are noticeable because it is the best electoral results for the far right since the time of Hitler. Now, I mean, that in any sort of normal democratic country would be reason to sort of pause for thought and a reason for concern. But for it to happen in Germany, where the taboo over Nazism is understandably so strong, is, I'd say, a real moment. But the man who's achieved this breakthrough, Björn Höcke, has sort of made his career around kind of poking around the edges of acceptable discourse over Nazism in Germany. Now, Germany has sort of stricter restrictions on free speech about Nazism than most European countries, than all European countries, because obviously it was the home of Nazism, and I think everyone could understand exactly why those rules exist. Everyone, that is, except Björn Höcke, who seems to basically make great play of dancing around the sort of the legal edges and the sort of semantic niceties, or atrocities might be a better term, that the Nazis used. So, for example, everything for Germany, alles für Deutschland. Höcke used that in a speech a few years ago. He said it at the end of the speech, and that was picked up by some people who thought it might be a reference to the motto engraved in the daggers, the SA motto you mentioned earlier, David. And so he was taken to court, and he was convicted of knowingly using Nazi slogans, and he was fined. Now, for most people, that would be the end of their political career, or so you'd hope. But not for Höcke. He sort of almost thrived on this controversy. In fact, it wasn't long after that in a stump speech, he sort of knowingly joked with his audience about it by going sort of everything for. And then if you can imagine them standing in this clearing, all screaming back at him, Deutschland. So, you know, he knows what he's doing. He's facing another court case because of that incident, despite the fact he's now the winner of the state election in Thuringia. And I mean, he is on the extreme wing of the AfD, but he is by no means not the only sort of Nazi-esque scandal which has hit the AfD. Its lead candidate in the European elections got in a lot of trouble because he made the point that not all Waffen-SS members were criminals. That is, you know, small potatoes compared to the revelations of the German media, but some members of the AfD attended a meeting with some very extreme right people where they discussed the mass deportation of foreigners from German soil. That sparked nationwide protests in Germany, where the Domestic Intelligence Service now says that the AfD are right-wing extremists. Now, you may remember, and I'm sure listeners will remember, the AfD had been around a while, and when they turned up on the scene, they were quite a bookish, nerdish, Eurosceptic, mildly Eurosceptic party founded by university professors in Hamburg. And, you know, they were sort of kind of intellectual, you know, weren't massive fans of the euro. But since then, they have radicalized quite to quite a severe degree. You know, if you look at say someone like Marine Le Pen, National Rally in France, Giorgia Meloni, Brothers of Italy, the Prime Minister of Italy, they moderated their rhetoric and moved more to the centre to try and make themselves more electable. That's not how the AFD has decided to play things. If anything, the extreme edge of the party now holds sway as Höcke, the leader in Thuringia, very much his kind of rising star. And his victory came when there were also state elections in Saxony. And the AFD lost out by just 1% to the opposition CDU. Now, there's a couple of things to say about this. I mean, first of all, no mainstream parties want to go into coalition with the AFD. So, we're not going to suddenly see a takeover of Saxony and Thuringia's regional sort of government. The other thing to say is that Thuringia and Saxony are in East Germany, poorer regions of Germany and heartlands for the AFD. So, this, with those caveats notwithstanding, this is still quite a significant shift. And there's a few sort of reasons for it. Cost of living, war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is sort of increasingly divisive among Germans, especially in the East. The AFD is a pro-Putin party. Patsies, basically. These are apologists for Putin and were even before the war in Ukraine. And of course, the big problem is Olaf Scholz himself. This is a man who, while I'm sure he's well-meaning, is not a man who's blessed with charisma or communication skills. He has got federal elections in less than a year. His coalition can't stop fighting amongst themselves. He has set records for low approval ratings in the polls. He led the SPD to their worst ever federal election result in the European elections earlier this month, where he was beaten by the CDU, who are expected to beat him next year, and the AFD. So, Germany is a country which is by no means a Eurosceptic country, right? I mean, this is a country which actually arguably sees the EU, one, as the source of its prosperity, and two, as kind of a way of expiating the guilt of World War II as well. It's a way of ensuring that they don't, excuse the somewhat British way of looking at it, is get back up to their old tricks again.
James, there's a lot in there. Thank you so much for talking us through that. Let's pick up on a few things. These are local elections, as you said, in Thuringia. Could you just sketch out for us the relationship of that to sort of national politics? It'd be good to give our listeners a sense of just how important is this?
So Germany is a federal republic. It has a federal government. That is currently the chancellor. That is Olaf Scholz. He leads a three-party coalition, the traffic light coalition, with the Greens and the pro-business. So that's the federal. Now, Germany's made up of different states. These are quite powerful. This is like, if you are the minister president of one of these states, that is a influential role. And that would be the role that Höcke would be expected to get if he was in charge of a normal, non-toxic party, after having won sort of more than 30% of the vote share. By reasons of comparison, right, in Thuringia, he won 30%, and Scholz got about 5%. And Scholz's coalition partners did even worse. So, these are, they very nearly sort of did the equivalent of losing their deposit. They very nearly didn't get a high enough percentage to have representation in the state parliament. So, if you think of something, it's as if, be a good county, it's as if somewhere like Yorkshire had a mayor which headed up his own sort of little government, basically. Now, the thing which is significant about it is the fact that it comes after the European elections, is that it involves the far right, who are taboo and have never been allowed to get so close to such high reaches of power before, and the fact that there's federal elections coming up next year, in September next year. This really does look like Scholz is on borrowed time. Now, what does that mean? We've seen him sort of flailing around a little bit. He wasn't helped, by the fact that we had the Solingen terror attack, where the suspect is a Syrian migrant. And, the AFD is an extremely anti-migrant party, so they obviously made great play of this. Scholz has basically sort of turned his back on the Merkel legacy of sort of open borders. which we saw during the migrant crisis, and is really trying to, he's sent the first Afghans back to Afghanistan, which is the first since the Taliban took over again there. He's wants to cut benefits down to the absolute bare minimum if migrants have arrived in Germany from another EU country. So he's trying to he's going on that more nationalist sort of line, but, it's too little too late, really, because why would you want a pale approximation of the real deal when you can have the real deal with the AfD, or you can have the real deal with the CDU, who have been saying this for longer?
James, zooming out slightly, what might this victory for the far right herald in the future for relations with Europe? Germany is at the heart of the European project. Does this potentially imply that could change in the future? What's your reading there?
I mean, the thing is we have this, in Germany they call it a firewall, in France they call it the cordon sanitaire. That's basically an agreement between mainstream, I would say, sane parties to keep the lunatics out. Certain cases, the lunatic racists. So you have the cordon sanitaire. Now, the problem with that is it does sort of come across as being kind of anti-democratic, and they don't always hold, right? So in the Netherlands, for example, there had been a cordon sanitaire against Wilders and his Freedom Party, or, the main centre-right party said they would never, work with him in a coalition. In the elections last year, they said, oh, well, actually, we probably would. And Wilders won. So, you then have this very difficult coalition negotiations, but Wilders' party is now part of the government. He's not prime minister because, he's problematic. He says stuff like, let's ban the Quran, let's have an exit referendum. But the fact is now that taboo's being busted, right? So once it's happened once, it can happen again. And I mean, if we look to Austria, the equivalent of the AfD is the FPO, the Freedom Party of Austria, which has been around for a lot longer, was founded by Nazis, former Nazi officers. It has been in government before. In fact, it was in government until there was a big scandal which saw it booted out of the coalition government a few years ago. And it looked like then it would be in the wilderness. But then we had coronavirus. And, there were certain moves made by the Austrian government, certain talk about compulsory vaccinations, which a smart, cynical politician like the FPO leader Herbert Kickl was able to really exploit. He has sort of basically led the FPO from the wilderness to topping the polls for the last couple of years off the basis of fear about an authoritarian crackdown being executed under the cover of coronavirus regulations. And then he feeds in a load of cultural stuff about trans rights, about migration, about Austrian neutrality, which is basically a cover not to back Western sanctions, because, if you think the AfD are pro-Putin, which the FPO still has a friendship treaty with United Russia, Putin's party. They are overtly and proudly a soft underbelly, in Europe. And they will win. It looks like they will win an election which is being held at the end of this month. So will there be a cordon sanitaire to keep the FPO from government when they've already been part of a federal government? I think the thing is, you're having a chipping away and a normalization of, I'll put on a commentator's hat here rather than an impartial journalist, but a normalization of basically a bunch of Fruit Loops.
James, one phrase that's been coming back again and again the last few years when talking about German foreign policy is Zeitenwende. It's this idea of Olaf Scholz that is a great turning point for Germany, and they'd no longer sort of be neutral. They would start restocking the army, building up weapon supplies, and Germany went from doing almost nothing to becoming a leading supporter of Kyiv, sending a huge amount of funding and weapons to Ukraine. Zeitenwende, a turning point. It sounds as if, from what you're describing, that there is a turning point coming, but it's not one potentially that Olaf Scholz envisaged.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, let's just take a quick look. Germany has been a massive and important donor of weapons to Ukraine. But Olaf Scholz is so bad at politics that everyone thinks that Germany has done nothing. And I mean, that really sort of sums up the man who sort of ran as a kind of a Merkel 2.0 candidate, despite him being centre-left and her being centre-right, and use her deputy. So, look, the Zeitenwende thing, it sounded great, didn't it? It sounded like a really much-needed sort of moment. Europe, many people in the EU, for example, when you chat to them will say, oh, we really would actually quite like the Germans to lead. It was something which I used to say all the time with Merkel was in power. We kind of want the Germans to sort of use their influence to get things going. Germany historically has been quite nervous about putting itself in a leadership role in European politics, again, because of its wartime past. Now, Olaf Scholz looked like he was doing something good there. He looked like it was almost, Merkel was always famous that basically she would prevaricate, and then do something big, like open the borders to 1 million Syrians, or agreeing to pool debt against the EU budget among member states. When she went to do something, it was big, it was historic, whether you agreed with it or not, right? Now, Scholz has tried to do this with Zeitenwende, but there's been plenty of talk in Germany that basically the money isn't enough, but it won't keep up with inflation. Not only that, they have this huge rick, which has really damaged confidence, where they've got this massive budget black hole, which came because they tried to recycle money, which had been put aside by the Coronavirus Recovery Fund from the EU, and they tried to put it elsewhere towards climate action. And then the Constitutional Court said, oh, you can't do that. So it was illegal what they were trying to do. So that left them with, I would have to Google it, but I can tell you we are talking about a huge, huge black hole in the finances, which has meant everything's going to have to be cut back. So they're cutting back on aid to Ukraine. Their argument is, we lobbied so that interest on frozen Russian assets in Europe could be used, so we don't have to give so much anymore. Well, tell that to Zelensky, right? I'm sure he's not going to be. You're more of an expert on that side of things than I am, David. I can't imagine he'd be very impressed, frankly. So we've got a sense of a guy who divers, who isn't really a sort of a clubbable or charismatic man, and a guy who keeps making mistakes, and a guy who also can't keep his coalition government in order, really. If you then add in the cost of living crisis, the fact that there's people in Germany, car industry particularly, who have a problem with the sort of the net zero goals, he just looks weak. And then on top of that, he gets his bottom handed to him by a bunch of, if not Nazis, should we say Nazi-adjacent people.
Zooming out then, finally, James, some of the things you describe and the issues you describe will be familiar to European listeners, whether in the UK or continental Europe. People listening from outside of Europe might be incredibly alarmed by the news you're bringing of the rise of the far right in Eastern Europe and in Germany and Austria, etc. Zooming out and keeping your commentator's hat on then, what would you say to them? How is Europe changing this year and what should they know?
Well, look, we say the rise of the far right. The rise of the far right in Germany. The rise of the far right in Europe? No, not so much, right? I'd say that actually the far right has been a fixture in Europe, for a long time. But let's say since 2014. In 2014, National Rally won the European Parliament elections for, on the fact they were the largest French party. That's significant. UKIP actually that year was the largest British party. There were other hard right, we could probably call them nationalist parties, which also did well. 5 years after that, 2019, the likes of Matteo Salvini's League, again, Le Pen, they kind of, they consolidated their results in those European elections. And then in the last elections, they grew. They improved on that consolidated result. So at a European level, they are a fixture. They are establishment now, as much as they would. We've got Giorgia Meloni, although she has moved to a more centrist position, her background, the party, Brothers of Italy, is the heir to Benito Mussolini's party. This is not that unusual, but true Finns who are in coalition government and came second in the elections there. They were, again, I've got to be careful I don't get them mixed up with Sweden Democrats who are basically propping up a centre-right government. Let's just say that there are Scandinavian parties who definitely were founded by white supremacists who are now in or very close to the corridors of power. You know, Marine Le Pen is her national rally. Okay, it's been toxified to a large extent, but it's not that long ago her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was saying very anti-Semitic stuff and talking about doing horrible things to Algerians. So, this stuff hasn't sort of gone away, and I'd suggest it's not just happening in Europe. I'd say it's happening in other places as well, maybe even North America.
James Crisp, thank you so much.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis, and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.